And if the problem was solved in the United Kingdom, I think it would not take long for it to perhaps become more prosperous than the United States. And I think my American friends might be skeptical of this, but I actually think that this would be quite achievable were these problems solved.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-Futurism.
Welcome back to the Anglo-Futurism podcast. I'm Callum Drysdale.
I'm Tomo, and today is a first for the programme. Callum, as usual, is in the King Charles III space station, tucked up with the blanket over his legs. But I'm broadcasting for the first time from terra firma.
Yes, Tom has accepted a commission to go to the New World as our man in the Bay Area. Under the cover of writing a book, he's sending coded dispatches on the activities of the separatist forces.
My contact, broadcasting from a hidden location here in San Francisco, is interested in what causes organizations, nations, and civilizations to decline, and what could be done to bring them back from the brink.
Though he wishes to keep his identity secret, he has given us a pseudonym by which to address him. Samo Burja, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Samo is the founder and president of Bismarck Analysis, an industrial analysis and consulting firm whose belief is that there exist many mature but failing organizations, be they companies or nations. Samo also runs Palladium magazine and is the author of the book Great Founder Theory, which is available online. Samo, we'd like to start by talking with you about failing organizations. And the context is, of course, that the West is achieving success like never before in some respect. And the mind turns, of course, to Starship being caught by those chopsticks. And at the same time, there is a profound sense of malaise. So our question to you is, how can a civilization or an organization be on the surface functional, but also at least giving us the feeling of it falling apart?
I think that in a very deep way, we should remember that there's always sort of a difference between a quantity and its first and second and third derivative. You achieve the high watermark just as the waters begin to recede. The simple reality is that as long as an organization functions somewhat, it can continue to make headway on any sort of metric, like a metric of a saturation of the social media space, the maturation of a technology, etc., etc. The second reason is that, well, the Western world is made up of many different organizations, and many of them could be failing while a few are working. We can talk about the success of SpaceX, and we can talk about the success of the Tesla electric vehicle. And if we weren't talking about Tesla, we would only be able to talk about Chinese EVs. So wait, why is the success of the Western world so tied to this, one individual? In a way, that's great. Means Elon's very accomplished. In another way, it's actually kind of concerning. It's like, okay, if you take away Elon and say Jensen and, maybe like 2 or 3 other technologist industrialists, right? You take away NVIDIA, Tesla, SpaceX, there's not that much to be proud of anymore. And in terms of like raw economic numbers, sure, the United States continues economic expansion, but this is not true of Europe, and it's not true of East Asia. So even if we grant a premise of American dynamism, this doesn't extend to the broader alliance. And that means that the system as a whole is declining, even if the US position within it is becoming more and more important. And again, US economic growth, remind me, it's like 2.7% or something like that. Well, they've at least grown over the last 10 years, but in the last year, something like 2.7%. So when the US does that, we call 2.7% growth American dynamism. And when China grows at 5% or 4%, we say China's on the verge of collapse. But of course, that's not true. China could easily sustain 4 or 5% growth for another 10 or 20 years. It'll amply catch up to the Western world and even make some gains on the United States. Though, of course, that does result in a more favorable balance of power between the United States and China. So I'm not saying that the slower growth doesn't matter. I'm saying that we really do judge these successes on different standards.
Favorable for China, maybe.
Perhaps in some ways. I mean, China is a relatively poor country to this day. I think it's a GDP per capita is sort of like what, Portugal tier, lower than Portugal, I think. There are a few provinces that are Poland tier. But when it comes to, say, energy consumption per capita in China has surpassed Italy and the United Kingdom. So I kind of believe when energy is burned, it's almost impossible not to create wealth. So I think we're in denial if we're saying they're not getting richer. The only question is like, are they set to be a big new economic hegemon or not? And I think there's a solid argument that there'll be other parts of the world that will grow very rapidly. I've just not heard a solid argument that those parts of the world will be in the developed world. What I've heard is sort of, Indian growth will eventually eclipse Chinese growth, et cetera, et cetera.
You mentioned Chinese energy production per capita becoming superior to that of, I think it was the UK and Italy.
Well, production and consumption, you can use either term, right? Because it's kind of matched in a way, usually.
Yeah, it seems that the West is less willing or capable than it used to be of rapidly improving its ability to produce energy. If this is the case, why do you think it is? Is it complacency or is it like the stifling nature of decades of bureaucratic buildup? What could it be?
I think that in the Western world, we have great difficulty in building anything. And for better or worse, almost all forms of energy production are basically construction projects. And at the end of the day, I think there is this great aversion to an expansion of that, an expansion of just construction near population centers. And this generalizes to all sorts of projects, all sorts of delays. So that's number one. Number two, we have set carbon reduction as a bureaucratic, carbon emissions reduction as a bureaucratic target. Setting it as a bureaucratic target, of course, results in the goal being a reduction of these emissions, even if there is economic damage on the margin. And the easiest way to not emit more carbon is to stop energy growth. It's much harder to change sort of the structure of the energy mix. Today, China builds more solar than anyone else, builds more nuclear than anyone else, builds more wind than most places, but not all, and of course builds more coal than anyone else. What they're doing is just energy through any means. If a Western country set its policy as energy through any means, and it just set a goal of radically increasing energy production, I'm sure two things would happen. I'm sure this country would drive innovation in carbon neutral energy sources faster than any green nation. And of course, also, it would emit more carbon because often the most sensible source of energy would be natural gas or coal. So really, we have to ask ourselves, do we believe that all energy technologies are already mature and the best thing for the climate is for us to slowly and expensively substitute the dirty sources for the clean sources? Or do we believe that clean technology has massive strides to make and that actually supply and demand would result in industrial learning and result in advances in the technology? And my position, it's almost from how I phrase this, it should be clear. I think massive advances remain possible, both in solar, but also in nuclear, and let alone more interesting sources like geothermal. And for this to happen, we sort of have to increase, not decrease energy demand. We have to stop taxing energy demand.
Because you talk in your book about the idea that institutions are not honest about their ability to no longer perform at the level that they once did, and thus they change their stated motives or maybe their hidden motives, sort of direction to a different and easier to achieve goal. And I think we see that particularly here in Britain with people like, Ed Miliband, who's leading a very big drive to cut carbon emissions, and he comes on television with his eyes wild with the fire of the zealot. But it doesn't seem that there is a corresponding... There's a lot of willingness to cut demand, but there isn't a willingness to to produce the supply. And do you think that this drive for net zero is a way of obscuring and hiding institutional weakness?
I mean, straightforwardly, if your organization fails to achieve a target, often it's easier to change what the target is, and then a failure becomes a success. In a straightforward way, if I say that, the country's economy is shrunk by 1 or 2%, that sounds bad. If I say we've cut carbon emissions by 1 to 2%, that sounds good. And often these two are the same picture. So essentially, if your country can't brag about building anything, it can brag about being the most environmentally friendly place.
So we're good-hearting ourselves into oblivion.
Well, in a lot of contexts, yeah. I think that, for example, it's notable that organizations must justify sort of their own existence to a very great degree. It's an interesting question. Once you have thousands of people working on a problem and the problem doesn't seem to be any better, seems to be worse than ever, why even bother? And this is part of why, say, in the United States, say DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which we'll see how real that is or not, it achieves some currency and some popularity because people have a hard time accounting what exactly these bureaucratic systems provide. Now, I want to make clear this isn't just a point in favor of government privatization. Boeing has demonstrated that private corporations are also just as capable of being complete bureaucratic failures. It was a complete failure to keep astronauts stuck in orbit for, 6 months?
It was a long time.
Yeah, 6 months stuck in space is a pretty long time, if not planned, with serious health consequences for the astronauts, mind you. Right? You lose bone density, you never get back. Your heart weakens in a way that, even with peak physical condition, you're never quite going to get back perfectly. So, astronauts like being in space. I'm not sure if they like being stuck in space. Further, Boeing has become kind of a byword for poorly maintained and at times flawed aircraft designs, right? Like poorly maintained planes and flawed aircraft designs. And, this shows that an old, mature company goes through, at least at a big scale, a very similar kind of bureaucratic decay as what happens within government. And the market is only a partial correction for it. There's a big literature on how long it takes for companies to go out of business. It takes a surprisingly long time. Schumpeter's Gale, so that is the engine of creative destruction, it might be more like, sort of a gentle breeze. And actually, often the best way for a company to be replaced actually requires this sort of exceptional competence where, whatever company is aiming to replace the incumbent, it can't just be 20% better. It has to be like 5 times better or 10 times better at a core function. And I think, this might sound like hyperbole, but since we mentioned Starship and so on, SpaceX did really decrease launch costs by basically an order of magnitude from where they were. And I think that's super notable. It's completely outcompeted anyone in the world. So it's not that Boeing is right behind SpaceX in its costs. No, Boeing is sort of there with the other countries and their launch costs, with the French and the Japanese and the Chinese.
Well, and we can compare SpaceX to NASA, and NASA's probably going to have to scrap its special launch system, which is extraordinarily expensive and does an inferior job to Starship. And when you write about organizations, you talk about how the stated behavior of an organization is often different from its actual one. So in this case, what is NASA's stated goal, and how does it differ from its behavior?
I mean, NASA has had difficulty justifying its own existence since the cancellation of the Apollo program. The Apollo program was supposed to be the start of a grand tour of the solar system, with robotic probes first exploring the outer solar system, and humans going to Mars, and eventually humans settling planets, and perhaps even traveling as far as Jupiter. In a way, 2001: A Space Odyssey is more science fiction today than it was in the 1960s when it was released. In the 1960s, it expected a near future of AI-piloted, nuclear-powered spacecraft exploring the moons of Jupiter. Today, we don't even make plans of anything like that, right? We do not imagine nuclear propulsion can be built in orbit. We perhaps allow that AI could control these robotic probes, etc. But no one's giving NASA the budget or mandate to put supercomputing clusters on board those spaceships, right? So you can't actually do like live piloting that well because you need a lot of compute, and that will require a lot of electricity, and the light speed limit means that you can't actually wait for the AI on Earth to decide something interesting to be done by, let's say, a plane flying on the surface of Mars. Like 4 minutes, too slow, too long a delay. And, I think that really shows something important and interesting, where the world of 2001, not only is it not here in 2024, it seems like it won't be here in 2100 either. There's something about the sheer scale and drive of it. Still, to go back to NASA diversified its portfolio. It tried to keep basically all of the existing jobs when the funding shock came. So when the cord was pulled, they had to choose between like sort of Skylab and the space shuttle and all of these programs. They decided to bet on the space shuttle. And now when the space shuttle was retired, they produced this basically unnecessarily complicated plan that includes things like the Lunar Gateway Space Station, and it includes alternate launch vehicles and landing vehicles, multiple contractors. Basically, you're trying to keep everyone employed. In a way, if you promote, say, an astronaut from NASA rather than a bureaucrat, they're enmeshed still in the NASA culture, and they will still try to keep all of these relevant departments going. They'll try to keep the Jet Propulsion Lab relevant. They'll try to keep the guys who used to work on space shuttle technology relevant. That's why Constellation tries to reuse some of the space shuttle technology, and so on and so on. And, organizations should be much more focused. There was also another drive in the early 2000s where, it suddenly became an important mission for NASA to observe the Earth and basically provide climate data. So there's an interesting way in which the more dire the climate emergency is, the more justifiable a part of the NASA budget dedicated to studying the climate emergency is. You don't need to go beyond low Earth orbit, because low Earth orbit is all you need for figuring out what's happening on the Earth. So you change your mission from the grand tour of the solar system to observing the Earth.
Abysmal.
And it seems like there are a lot of organizations in this way that are coasting off their reputation. So ones that once they were effective and now exist merely as a shadow or a way of carrying on that legacy of prior successes. And here in Britain, we've got the example of the Navy, that the Navy that once maintained the 2-power standard. At the moment, all 6 hunter-killer submarines are in repairs, and our Army, we've got a falling number of soldiers in wartime.
If the soldiers were being replaced by high-tech drones, this would not necessarily be a failure. But I doubt that that's what's happening. You can correct me if that's wrong.
And why do you think the people, because there are obviously very intelligent people working at NASA, why do you think they are unable to spot this, or this rot that seems to exist in their own institution?
I think that when you do business a certain way, it becomes very hard to argue that it's possible to do business any other way. And they might see a lot of these programs as suboptimal, as not quite being well funded enough to make sense. And then it's like, well, that's basically Congress's fault. And we have only very limited means to market for our own budget and lobby for our own budget. After all, we're not straightforwardly a national security organization, right? So in some places, even national security is starved. This happens in Europe. In the United States, for now, defense has a generous budget. But NASA, for example, if you asked, say a NASA administrator or an astronaut or a technician, does NASA need a facility in all 50 states? Like a facility per state? No, it does not. But we have to do this, because then congressmen will not cut budgets, because then we'll inform congressmen that, then we're going to have to close our facility in the great state of Hawaii. And then the Hawaiian congressman, of course, reconsiders his position and carves out a little exception that gives NASA a little bit more money to keep that facility in Hawaii, right? Or in Texas, or in Iowa, or in Arkansas, or New Jersey, or wherever, right? So it's sort of a passing of the buck, where you take how your organization basically sustains itself, and you argue it's better for us to do what we're doing than not. So the means that we sustain ourselves are legitimate compromises, and it's totally unrealistic to want something else. Let me propose that this was not the thinking of the founding generations of NASA. Von Braun worked literally with Walt Disney to create a series of documentaries. I think it's Man in Space, Man on the Moon, Men on Mars, and Beyond. And these were animated films that, among other things, Eisenhower showed in the White House to his staff to sort of convince his own staff that NASA was a good idea, right? And these were just, documentaries, animated films, released to the public. The public was lobbied. The public was excited to think about space, the adventure of space. But of course, it takes charismatic people. It takes Walt Disney to be in charge of Disney, and it takes the guy who made NASA to be, perhaps a morally complicated individual. Of course, he was firing rockets at London before he was firing them at the moon. But, it's, as he said, that's not really his department. What he was interested in was developing rocket technology, any means necessary. And, those means were sometimes, military. Other times they were civilian. And, he could contribute to the defense complex, but he probably couldn't run it, even in the United States of the 1960s. But a civilian, nominally civilian agency, okay, that he could run. And he wasn't the only space enthusiast. And I think what is missed here is that the political currency came out of persuading the American public that space was the future. Believing that space was the future underwrote the great investments into space through them seeming inevitable. If they seem inevitable, you seem forward-looking or visionary by pursuing them. And actually, today we have convinced the public that climate apocalypse is inevitable. Therefore, actions you take to drive to a somewhat miserable existence of energy poverty and frequent natural disasters, that's actually seen as forward-looking and preparing for the inevitable. You don't try to invest in geoengineering. You try to invest in better dikes to keep New Orleans not flooded. You don't try to invest into growing energy. You try to invest into, how are we going to deal with lower energy consumption? Let's increase efficiency. Now, I'm not going to go back immediately on the energy point, but it's such a good example, right? Where a pessimistic vision, a pessimistic definitive vision will beat not just generalized non-specific pessimism, it'll beat non-specific optimism too. And this is where I have a problem with my progress studies friends. For all their strengths, they offer non-specific optimism. And you know what? If I say that the world is going to end due to AI, or the world is going to end due to climate disasters, that's pretty specific. We know what we can do to make that better or make it worse. I don't know what it means for the economy to keep on growing at 3 to 4%, and no one else does either.
This rather reminds me of what Peter Thiel says about definite optimism, and how societies that have a more tangible vision of the future, like 1950s and 60s America, where there's an aesthetic to that future, are those that thrive, and those that have perhaps a less visualizable sense of decline, and he cites modern Europe, are those that will decline. But my question to you is, given that, like, the fracturing in the modern media landscape, it strikes me that the public is simply probably less easy to persuade and less easy to impute a vision to. Do you think that's right? Or is it just as simple as it's ever been to sweep up a population with your optimism?
First off, I should actually finish the answer to the NASA question where I said that there were 3 reasons, right? And I gave 2. And the first one was you take, business as usual that sustains your current organization as the only way an organization can be sustained. And the second reason was, well, in the absence of a grand vision, you go about for anything that justifies, instead of growing your means to match ends, you shrink your ends or transform your ends to match your means, right? That's why you go for low Earth orbit, not for high Earth orbit, or not for the moon and not for Mars. And then the third one that I didn't really talk about, but I'll be very brief before I answer your new question, is that, no one wants to fire their friends. Imagine you're a NASA astronaut, you work with the simulator team for 10 years, then you went to the ISS, you worked with the space station guys for 2 years as you were prepping for your mission, and then you worked with the shuttle guys for another year, like sort of redesigning the spacesuit, and then you become director of NASA maybe 10 or 15 years later. And that's kind of already a populist move, like we're going to make an astronaut the head of NASA, not this bureaucrat. Well, are you going to fire the spacesuit guys, the space shuttle guys, the space station guys? Are you going to fire the simulator guys? It's kind of like, who are you going to fire? Are you going to fire all your friends? Partially the people who lobbied for you, who said that you are a competent administrator, not just a flyboy? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And I could tell the same story for an administrator of any background, right? Coming into NASA, coming in from the culture of an organization. All organizations kind of develop, and this is actually healthy, a spirit of self-protection. It's just that when you are protecting an absence of vision and a sort of getting by perspective, does this come to be does this come to the detriment of the public, right? And to the detriment of the general interest. I'm sure that employees at SpaceX are very loyal to SpaceX. And, but I'm also going to say 50 years from now, I would predict all else equal, SpaceX will be a dysfunctional organization if it still exists, because this is an inevitable life cycle and requires constant reform, deep reform, or refounding and replacing of SpaceX with Space Y or Space Z or whatever future iteration of creative disruption we can pursue. Now, to maybe address the media question, which is still very relevant to point 2 that I made, so the point about vision. I don't think Elon has had a harder time selling his vision than Von Braun did. Maybe the means have changed, but I think people are very open to a vision. Has not OpenAI succeeded at selling the world on a vision of an AI future? A vision that previously was only shared by a few, nerds and tech weirdos?
No, I totally disagree.
Okay,
I think
let's hear that.
There's a lot of fear about AI. So normies fear that AI will come for their jobs, and
environmentalists fear that it will use up all the water. Right? There is a very coherent and efficient reaction against these visions that I would say.
And nerds fear that the machine gods will come for us all. And I think this is a range of disputation that I find difficult to imagine would have occurred when Von Braun was around.
It actually did, though. There was a slogan, billions for space, pennies for the poor. Right?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, Whitey on the moon.
There was a slogan of and there was this famous song, Whitey's on the moon, right? So there was an argument that space is a waste of funding compared to social issues. Turns out we ran the social issues funding budget. Space is a rounding error compared to, welfare as such. We spend something like immense amounts of money on trying to solve social problems. And the problems are at best ameliorated on the margin. Now I'm in favor of certain kinds of spending, but pardon?
I was going to say, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, there's an account called Days of NHS Spending across here in Britain. that any discussion of funding or allocation of funds can immediately be recast into this will fund the NHS for 20 seconds. You know, the black hole at the centre of the British state is ever hungry.
And of course, that black hole is sacred, right? You cannot attack the NHS.
And it gets larger every year.
Replacing or
by
cutting
definition.
the NHS.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you know, I'm just always in favor of these like very radical thought experiments where, you know, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question if NHS funding were completely cut and all of it directed to the development of novel pharmaceuticals. Like, pretty straightforward. It's like, we will pay you, AstraZeneca or whoever, X amount of money for a drug with these properties that permanently solves this problem. You don't have to worry about marketing it anywhere else. You know, it might be a disaster on year 1, but on year 10 or 20, I bet actually the health outcomes would be better.
Samo, you get locked up in England for proposing that idea.
I mean, also it would cause Britain to dominate global pharmaceutical industry. I mean, sorry for telling you how to win. I mean, it's not that simple, but it's an absurd thought experiment because it's absurdly plausible on the face of it. With that amount of spending and R&D directed for the goal of a drug with these properties, even AstraZeneca could go very, very far. It could hire the talent from the world, possibly use the budget for that. And of course, the medicine itself, you know, because the government's paying for it, it could just be a generic. It could just be offered to the British public without markup, maybe to the American public with a markup, to the European public with a markup. And, you know, a country that's a mid-sized country like the United Kingdom should be searching. You know, Britain is not great. It's middle-sized. Britain should be seeking to compete with the South Koreas of the world. They're about its peer population-wise, and probably about its peer in terms of intellectual firepower.
Imagine if Ozempic had been created by the NHS, right? The Danish economy has been changed by this, and imagine if that had a "Made in the UK" sticker on it.
It easily could have, right? However, there is one systemic difference between AstraZeneca and Novo Nordisk. AstraZeneca does business as usual. It's a normal pharmaceutical company where it's basically this, it's basically a spreadsheet that does many small bets that the leadership does not technically understand on many different drugs that are plausibly marketable. Meanwhile, Novo Nordisk, it's like, we solve diabetes. So what we do is just diabetes drugs. And the result of this is sometimes the leadership even understands something about diabetes. And it's possible to have a 10 or 20 or 30-year career at Novo Nordisk and talk to other people about facts related to diabetes. And Ozempic is a side effect of that tech tree of trying to understand diabetes deeply. So I think Novo Nordisk was structurally a little bit better suited, but nothing prevents, say, AstraZeneca from being like perhaps a conglomerate of those were it large enough, or to be like, okay, you know what, here at AstraZeneca, the only thing we focus on is non-bullshit Alzheimer's. We have a whole department that's dedicated to disproving fraudulent Alzheimer's research, which, by the way, is a massive problem in academia. And, you know, we're going to make a lot of academic enemies, but we're going to solve Alzheimer's. And you know what? In a graying world, that's the second best market to corner after diabetes.
Exactly. The fatties.
So many drugs like that we can be making.
The fatties have already been cornered, but we can get the senile. It feels like a good metaphor for Britain.
And the world's producing more senile people at an ever accelerating rate as it grays. Right? There will probably be 100 million or 500 million people with Alzheimer's. They might already be 100 million people with Alzheimer's, but we're going to hit 1 billion senile people by the end of the century. If you look at the statistics of how likely you are to develop end-of-life dementia and the sheer number of old people that there will be on the planet at 2,100.
We're straying a bit here, and we must get back to the script.
We can go back to the script, but maybe we should be live players and go off script.
Yeah. But this is what
I'm now disrupting the show, right? I'm not just disrupting the British economy. I'm disrupting your show format.
Well, this podcast is the British economy.
Okay, quick tangential question for you, Samo. Given given the exciting prospects of developing these Alzheimer's drugs, and given that there's much unmet demand for other pharmaceutical things that could perhaps help us have babies easier or live longer, it strikes me that somewhere like Prospera in Honduras, there's this free charter city, which is trying to adopt a liberal approach to biotech innovation. Somewhere like that is going to make an absolute killing at some point in the 21st century, because they are developing drugs that people really want, but the Western governments don't allow people to experiment with.
I think it's definitely possible. The key point here is that I think this sort of deregulation of just research works much better if you are near an intellectual center. Ideally, you want the UCLA professor to be able to fly out on the weekend or commute to your lab. So actually, the optimal position would be, an hour away from MIT, an hour away from London, an hour away from UCLA, an hour away from Berkeley or Stanford. But territorially, there are only very few places that can do this. So again, not to riff on Britain too much, but the great autonomy of Jersey Island is underutilized. Jersey Island could be the center of amazing research world over, exempt from a lot of the laws made by Parliament. Correct me if I'm wrong, but British Parliament cannot make laws for Jersey Island.
We have previously on this podcast discussed the reclamation of Dogger Bank and the creation of a high-tech city in the North Sea. It occurs to me that this would be
the new Atlantis, but literally.
The new Atlantis, but rising out of the sea and returning and churning out Alzheimer's drugs for the metropole.
Well, but I explained a reason for my pessimism for Honduras, right? So if you do a free city, Honduras is nowhere near a major intellectual center. And while in theory it might sound cool, even Silicon Valley guys are never going to leave the Bay Area or even Austin to go live in Honduras for an extended period of time, all except the most ideological ones. However, I could see in Honduras there being, say, medical clinics, since people demonstrably will fly out to receive treatment, right? So people fly out to Istanbul apparently for cosmetic surgeries, for some reason, for cosmetic procedures. I bet that they would fly out to Honduras to receive, rejuvenation therapies and so on. So I think as far as medical tourism goes, yes. As far as cutting edge research, I'm more skeptical. I think cutting edge research is always a question of human capital. So you have to have the deregulation or the incentives, both social and economic incentives for innovation, even if not deregulation per se, must be where the human capital is. So this sort of brings me to the topic of social technologies, which we should talk about. I think that it is a helpful reframing to not think of culture as culture, but as social technology, as an analog to material technology. That is a code of law, conduct, a protocol of coordination, a social convention transforms what happens in society. And it's fruitful to think of societies with or without something like rule of law, with or without something like a market economy, with or without something like, let's call it Protestant, let's put it this way, Protestant friendship could be considered a social technology. For example, did you know that when the first joint stock corporations came into being, the brethren who gathered were also religious brethren, working out their salvation in the next world, not just their profit in this. And in the Netherlands would open their meetings by praying together.
That's so easy before the podcast.
Now, I'm not saying that modern corporate boards were made to pray, but...
Salvation through the AGM?
I mean, wait, but I'm saying here for real that the people who were in the 16th or 17th century, sometimes risking their lives or risking their fortunes, sending out ships to the far corners of the world, the reason they could trust strangers or people who are not their relatives is because they considered them brothers and sisters in Christ. So it was an important sort of evolution of the nature of trust. Now, you can make an argument that we've either risen above that level, that bar, or fallen below it. But if you analyze a civilization and a society and you compare that to, I don't know, what were the Frisians doing 200 BC, right? They were probably not quite eating people from neighboring Frisian islands, but they were probably at least sacrificing them to the bog gods, right? You know those mummies found in bogs, perfectly preserved with the bronze daggers and all of that? Well, they were at least sacrificing each other, right? And in that case, you probably couldn't trust anyone more distant than your cousin to sail with you to the next island, and that they wouldn't sell you out and, you know, sell you as a slave or something. What a difference 2,000 years made, right? 2,000 years made such a difference on those islands in the Netherlands.
I was going to say there's a rather astonishing parallel to this that actually we see in the modern day, which are the Murid Brotherhood. I don't know if you've come across them, out of Senegal, who are a Islamic sect that actually have a very, very similar ethos to those early Protestants, that for them, their saint told them to achieve closeness to God through work and through honesty. And actually you find that a lot of the people hawking goods at tourist locations in France and across Europe are in fact Murids, because it's very, very easy. They have these very developed money transfer networks that allow them to move money across borders. By if there is a Murid who is flying back to Senegal, you can hand him 10,000 euros and you know it's going to arrive. Or you hand a Murid in Paris money, and then his brother will then buy your mother in Kaolack a washing machine. And that these networks of trust are so strong. And I think that is the best example of, well, you're welcome to disagree, but of this social technology. It is on par with technology and what it allows for the leveraging and maximization of human effort, because you don't need to worry about these things.
I completely agree, because, the promise of sort of the cryptocurrency world has been now for over a decade of trustless transactions, right? Not needing to actually trust a human for money to go from point A to point B, only needing to trust computers and mathematics. Now that's actually kind of a heady vision, because it proposes allowing all societies of the world to essentially participate in something that is a high trust, verifiable system, whether or not they had social and cultural prerequisites of it. I certainly think that if that vision came to be, that would be a good material technology for the world. But you don't actually need encryption. You can just have this kind of brotherhood that you mentioned, and introducing that to a society that starts off as low trust, like the bogfarers that I described earlier. That is innovation. That is innovation as well. And that has shaped world history as much as any material technology has. Because at the end of the day, material and social technologies co-create each other. And there is not a machine in this world that does not require the coordinated behavior of millions and millions of featherless bipeds, right? I don't think it's very controversial if I say that the main reason that the Soviet Union fell behind technologically behind the United States is that it just had an inferior social technology stack to that of the United States for rewarding innovation, at least in computer technology. Maybe they could keep up in space or even lead sometimes. Maybe they could sort of be okay at building nuclear reactors. They certainly weren't as good at maintaining them. As Chernobyl demonstrated. But the US and the Western world ran ahead in genetics, ran ahead in computer science, and so on. And I think because of this, we shouldn't assume, we got it all figured out. There's no more social innovation to be done. All our social innovation is about fixing problems in the margins rather than finding social innovation that accelerates. I think that's a wrong perspective. I think we should be hunting for new social technologies that make even the most innovative countries of today look like the Soviet Union of the past. And I don't think the answer is as simple as more markets. I love markets. We can have more markets. But often, the difference between a low trust and a high trust society might be actually that strange religious brotherhood, or a strange secular brotherhood, right? The Age of Enlightenment, if I call it a conspiracy of deists against a fanatical public, like that's a fairly good description of the 18th century, both the English version of the Enlightenment and the Scottish version and the American version, but also the French version. And not all of these worked out equally well, but the Jacobin Club in Paris, or perhaps the Freemasons among the coordinating the America's founding fathers. I think these are clear examples also of social change led by an unusual group of people with an unusual set of coordinating mechanisms. So I think that in the modern world, we should conceive perhaps that maybe AI is not so much driven by just markets and just capital forces, but the deep conviction of perhaps as little as 50 to 100 people that AI represents a great danger or a great opportunity. And let me justify this. I think if you say AI is so dangerous it might end the world, this almost causes governments to immediately want to research and support AI. I think if you actually want to slow down AI, you would say AI is kind of stupid and it's not going to ever work and it's never going to amount to anything, and we should just focus on building electric vehicles or the Chinese are going to have our lunch. So in a way, the doomer position is not maximally anti-accelerationist. The maximally anti-accelerationist position might just be Gary Marcus.
Well, if you can coordinate the doomers, then yes, but some of them are always going to break ranks.
No, but I'm just chatting here a little bit about how I think we should remember there was the doomers that created OpenAI.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The initial, there was all these scientists who were convinced, some of them on a deeply spiritual level, that the universe wants more intelligence. Like you listen to Ilya Sutskever, he says, the models want to learn. Or you listen to Sam Altman, it turns out intelligence is a fundamental property of the universe. It can be hard to take a businessman as literally as you should when they make these statements. Imagine you actually think that intelligence is a fundamental property of the universe. Of course you're going to dedicate your life to unlocking it. Of course you're going to do it when it's a boring academic job and when it's a $100 billion company. Anyone who starts doing it only after it's a $100 billion company will happily stop doing it to turn their $100 billion company into a $200 billion company. So actually, wildly strange metaphysical beliefs, like beliefs that we're maybe all in a simulation, which if it sounds Gnostic, it's just because it is. It's Gnosticism with more math. These can motivate these individuals, and they also bond over it, right? And they bond over the science fiction they read, and then they pursue and invest their money in certain ways. And Elon is perhaps, he has publicly claimed that he is very worried about AI, fears AI. I think that if a 16th century Dutch gentleman was listening to him, he would say, oh, you're acting out of fear of God or fear of the devil. I can relate to this as well,
So, Samo, you've previously talked, well, in your book, you talk about great founder theory, and you've touched on it throughout our discussion so far. Do you want to quickly give an overview of what that actually is, so that listeners can understand it on a more kind of coherent basis?
It's basically a broad theory of history where it proposes that human agency does in fact shape the course of human history. So that is like the decisions of particular individuals end up mattering immensely. However, it is distinct from some other great man theories in that it proposes that it's not so much through the steering of great events that the great men and women of history make their impact on civilization, but is rather through the creation of exceptional institutions, right? Where an institution is almost an embodiment of a social technology, right? Does it make sense to talk about Catholicism without the Catholic Church? No, not really. Does it make sense to talk about feudalism in the 7th century AD without Charlemagne's particular take on how a Frankish tribal alliance should be run? No, not really. And so on and so on. Whenever someone invents a social technology, it is not purely a theoretical exercise where they, like Plato, propose the perfect republic on paper. Unlike Plato, who was exiled from Syracuse, right, and failed to persuade the tyrant of Syracuse to have his successor adopt and successfully adopt his ideal constitution, you actually have to create a working prototype of that social technology. So that's something that's open to rulers like Charlemagne, but it is potentially also open to others, right? It is open to Confucius, who basically has a band of scholars following him around China, going from court to court, sort of offering their freelance services to run this or that warring state well. And from that arises the sort of like intellectual and ethical foundation of that civilization, arguably until the present day. Or a great prophet, with 12 or more disciples. A live player is someone who is capable of going off script. Scripts, I implicitly here claim, are basically social technologies, right? The idea of how to be a good doctor. What is a good doctor supposed to do? Is a good doctor supposed to keep confidentiality? Are they supposed to do no harm? Etc., etc. That's a social technology. That's a social convention. That's very particular to a society. Being able to go off of that script in a competent way means usually some sort of derivation of a first principles reasoning or a first principles intuition, where you create new modes of behavior and you successfully implement them just on the fly. And I think a good sign of a live player is someone that has been immensely successful at several adjacent or unrelated domains. So if someone has gone high achievement not just once, but once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, then you just know that that's kind of a live player. And to some extent, all of us have some of that capability, but I think by default, it's psychologically safer for us to choose to follow the norm, because in a way that comes with fewer risks. And then sometimes this is rational to not do something uniquely, but I think I would push so hard as to say that it is much more often irrational, and it's from a desire to be sort of accepted and not be in an unpleasant situation where someone might disagree with what you're doing. And it's almost kind of this crabs in a bucket situation where we punish anyone that stands out. So I think this is very normal in crowds. It's also normal that some people break away from the crowd. I think that, if they can do a good job of that, I think live player is a pretty good title. Not everyone who's a live player, even if they say found a new company, is a great founder, because a great founder would be an innovator in social technology. So let's put it this way. I think Elon Musk gets to be a great founder if he does one of 2 things. 1, actually radically changes the effective constitution of the United States and how the US government is run. Or alternatively, creates the first Martian society and has a big word and saying how it's organized. So those 2 would actually be sufficient. And until then, he's just like an amazing entrepreneur and an industrialist, sort of on par with, like a Rockefeller from the 19th century. So the bar is pretty high for being a great founder, right? It's Confucius, Jesus, Muhammad, Charlemagne, America's founding fathers, right? And so on. But wouldn't it make sense that to shape the history of mankind, or even of a civilization, the bar must be very high? Because in a way, every effort below that bar, it sort of cancels itself out, right? There's usually some sort of like underlying autopilot future. So if I were to rephrase the great founder theory, it doesn't deny great historical trends and forces, but it says those are often the autopilot of long dead great founders who perhaps never even thought things through, right? There's still things about how particular details of law were set in stone by or put on paper by Emperor Justinian of the Eastern Roman Empire that shape how civil law is done today in Germany or France or hell, even Louisiana.
Listeners, keep that set of theories in mind in the second half of the show. For now, I'm going to demonstrate myself to be a great man of history by unilaterally taking us to a break.
Is your OAP in need of more and more TLC? Is your aged P getting a bit OLD? Think they need some help, but you lack the P? At Sunny Cove Retirement Community in Oilfield, we provide the very best of care for your loved ones at rates much cheaper than our competitors. Located in the British Antarctic Territory, at Sunny Cove we go the extra mile by engaging your loved ones in daily activities that allow them both to stay fit and healthy, and also socialise through a carefully curated programme of activities designed by award-winning physiotherapists. Examples of past activities have included remote survey robot operation to work on hand-eye coordination, moving of full oil wagons to train both push and pull strength, and aquarobic style exercises in the bitumen evaporation pools. So what are you waiting for? Call us today for a brochure. Terms and conditions apply. Sunny Cove is only sunny in the southern hemisphere summer. Mean sunniness equals 8.34 hours per day.
Listeners, welcome back. This is part 2 of our interview with Samo Burja, and we're going to be talking a bit more in the second half of the show about Britain and her destiny. But before we do that, Callum, I wanted to share that when my great aunt moved to Sunny Cove, which was of course just in that advert, she would call the whole time to tell us what an amazing time she was having there and what meaning she was deriving from the experience of being in the Antarctic.
It was the same with mine, actually. In fact, I got a letter from her the other day saying that she was doing so well that they were promoting her to foreman and dropping her fees by 10%, which, tell you what, very nice on my wallet.
And we are now going to talk about the question of whether Britain is a live player. Callum, take it away.
I think the fact that we're even asking the question maybe is an answer in and of itself. But, Samo, when do you last think Britain was a live player or was driven by live players?
Right, so you can have organizations or even countries basically demonstrate being live players, where it's either like an individual or a relatively small coordinated group of people directing bureaucracies or taking moves on behalf of the relevant entity. So yeah, it does make sense to ask when Britain was a live player, just as it makes sense to ask when Apple was last a live player. And I think that for the United Kingdom, well, first off, whatever one thinks of Brexit, the people that pursued Brexit were doing something relatively new. It was a live player move to pursue an advanced Brexit. Now, what was done after Brexit, and whether that opportunity or calamity, however you think about it, depending on your political spectrum, it's certainly not been capitalized. So I think Britain has been sort of dead player even in carrying out Brexit, right? It didn't seem like there was a seizing of opportunity there. And every political disaster is a political opportunity, and vice versa. Every political opportunity and exciting development is a disaster for someone, from some ideological perspective or project. So there was that. And then, perhaps to give on the other side of the political spectrum, this attempted rebranding of cool Britain in the 1990s. I think that sort of worked for a while. So that was interesting. And I honestly, I think Thatcher was pretty interesting. She had a theory of what was the source of British prosperity and actually pursued a fairly coherent picture, waged war on the unions, didn't quite wage war on the universities. So I think that's why she ultimately lost. But I think the Britain shaping the world, I think that was last truly true, basically World War II. I think the reason this is why World War II is so mythologized, because that's clearly when when the decisions and actions of Britain mattered for the fate of the world last. And it's hard to say anything since has been as impactful, right? Hard to say anything since. And now, this doesn't mean that if you get into World War III, Britain will suddenly matter again. Like, that's not what that means at all. To be clear, it's more that in a way at that point Britain still had immense technical potential, and it still has immense technical potential, right? And it had strategic influence in like so many of the geopolitical flashpoints of the world. So a live player would not try to recreate the British Empire as it once existed, would not try to recreate, I don't know, like the Britain of the 1990s. I think they would look at Britain as it is today, and they would see the potential for various new things that have never been done before, and try to pursue those. There's, of course, persistent historical advantages and facts. So it's not totally unrelated, but it's you rethink it and maybe you rediscover something that's traditional for Britain. Okay.
I just went and saw Dominic Cummings speak on Sunday, and he talked about the effect of Northcote Trevelyan and the reforms, I think, and how he called it a tumour, that you have an institution at the heart of British government who is unable to act coherently and follows just these scripts. And the question is, has Britain lost the social technology to be functional? Is it, with our adoration of the NHS, our organisation that sits at the heart of government being sort of non-functional, envy at big business, are we unable now to return to a state of aliveness or being live again?
I think in theory, Britain has a system that is actually open to a fairly democratic method of change, which is, if you have a highly effective political party that is not made illegal and that is reasonably well funded and organized, and you achieve something approaching a majority in parliament, in theory, a lot of the bureaucracy could be defeated. Now, who is to make such a party? And in a very real sense, in the Western world, I think most people don't even understand what a strange machine a political party is. A political party, in fact, is a social technology that did not exist in the 18th century, that came into existence in the late 19th century in a parliamentary context, that had a somewhat disastrous set of detours in the 20th century, where the parliamentary party became this sort of single party state. And, one could argue that China is the world's most effective single party state. But I think it would be incorrect to call modern Western countries multi-party democracies, because the political parties are basically these strange brands without any truly unique vision for the future or any ability to carry them out. And they're mostly in a certain amount of agreement with each other and a certain amount of collusion in how fake they are and how much they have abdicated the business of governing the countries to bureaucracies. So I would say that in the Western world, we have something like personality-driven democracy opposed to entrenched bureaucracy. And then personality-driven democracy sometimes gets called populism. It has a very hard time defeating bureaucracy. So let's put it this way. I think in Britain, a lean and efficient political party could do quite a bit. It could do quite a bit, but it would have to be bigger than a personality. And it would have to be a coherent set of very talented people running it. And they would have to be more interested in the business of governing than the business of being a public media personality. And that's tricky, right? Because you have to be a public personality to get the voters' attention in the first place. So in the US, this is a bit more difficult, right? In the US, you have all of this fragmentation and so on, but in Britain, a lot can be done just by parliament.
You talk about the kind of political force that would be required to arrest Britain's slump, as it were. Do you think something like the Startup Party might be able to do that in time for the next general election?
Well, it really depends. I think that it is exactly the kind of effort that would be needed. Whether it will be developed in time, well, that depends on the political environment. I think that Britain has immense human capital still at its disposal, immensely talented people. And if there is an advantage compared to the United States, perhaps the advantage is actually in the sparsity of opportunity in the British environment compared to the American one. In America, you have very few reasons for even a modestly talented individual to enter politics. In a way, Elon's pivot to Donald Trump was so effective because there was no one anywhere close to Elon on the Democratic Party side who would neglect their business ventures or there are other opportunities to boost Harris, right? Like it's hard to imagine, right? Them actually taking time. Now, them writing a check, sure, but that money is almost necessarily wasted because it's spent by a machine that's sort of cancerous and dysfunctional and already like deeply fragmented and is not attracting the best human capital. However, in Britain, you know, I know there's still economic opportunities in the city. So, of course, London is its own beast. But on a global scale, you know, there's obviously also brain drain, but there's still many, many very smart people who could exert their energies quite well if given the opportunity, and they understand that there is some amount of political opportunity. So I think that's a reason for optimism, right? Where it's sort of like government is the problem, the dysfunction of government is the problem in both the United Kingdom and the United States. But in the United Kingdom, much less is going on. So perhaps the energies can be focused on actually solving the problem. And if the problem was solved in the United Kingdom, I think it would not take long for it to perhaps become more prosperous than the United States. And I think my American friends might be skeptical of this, but I actually think that this would be quite achievable were these problems solved. So I really wish to see this where, can you imagine a Britain that has 50% lower energy costs than the United States, powered by nuclear reactors that they export to the rest of the world, that they build more cost efficiently than the South Koreans? I mean, maybe they don't export to China, but they can certainly beat anyone else. Or the world where there is a massive investment from the government into a supercomputing center in London that is the world's largest supercomputing center and is offered at discount rates to companies that wish to train their models there with the legal backing to do that. That is within the power of the British government. It is within its power to do that. It is within its power to make London the center of global compute. And I think in the United States, in theory, that's in the power of Washington, D.C., but power so dissolute, devolved, to make that decision is almost impossible. Look at France. Look at what Emmanuel Macron has done. Whatever you think else he might have done, he certainly, out of nothing, managed to bring together a small French AI industry, right? And that's partially also a function of power being relatively vested in a relatively democratic figure, and him personally being convinced this is the economic future. If you had a British politician to present to the British public this vision of, we're going to have very cheap electricity, including very cheap natural gas, we're going to do everything we can to get enough energy to build and sustain these data centers around London, and London is not going to be the financial center of the world, it will be the intelligence center of the world. We're going to have the best AI scientists of the world move here. And in fact, all of the sciences, because they will all need AI, and we're going to win the AI race versus the United States and China. And we can do this because we are free of the EU, and we will use AI to solve climate change. Look, here's our little AI computer simulator. It's going to figure out how to fix the climate for us. I don't know. I think people would get excited. You pair those things up together, I think that sounds pretty good. You're no longer worried about losing your job. Or you can even go so far as to say, we're building this giant supercomputing cluster, and every British citizen will receive 5 stocks in the supercomputing cluster because it's being built with public money, and you can hold those or you can sell those, and that can be your UBI. It's going to make all of us so rich. Like, as a populist measure. I don't think there's any law that stops you from doing that, actually.
It'll fund the new NHS after you've totally gutted it to develop new drugs.
No, but still, like look at how easy it would be, right? Like, you have a world city,
we're swooning
you have
over here.
IQ, you have a grand narrative of the future. You can say, we actually started the AI revolution the first time. We built, Parliament funded it in the 19th century. Why can't it fund it in the 21st? I'm here talking about Charles Babbage's differential and analytic engine, which received non-trivial funding from Parliament. Like, very non-trivial funding. Do you guys remember that?
I didn't know that it had parliamentary funding.
Of course it did. Who else do you think would fund it? That's because Parliament worked then. It doesn't work
Some
today.
gentleman inventor. Well,
this is just one vision, right? You could pursue a vision of space privatization for the United Kingdom, where the British government were to put a prize for the first British company that can put 100 tons into low Earth orbit at a certain cost point. I guarantee you they would lag behind SpaceX, but they would be catching up fast, perhaps faster than China, right? And then say, okay, our national aim is to compete with Elon Musk. We can do it. We can do it together. Maybe this would even excite the left. I don't know.
Yeah, and as you've said, the Prime Minister has a lot of executive power, which is perhaps a little underused. And more adventurous prime ministers could do some very swashbuckling things, like you and I were talking about the British Antarctica territory,
Right.
and what potential there is there to start mining, for instance.
I mean, the world's largest oil reserves were found off the coast of Antarctica. I mean, it's Saudi Arabia comparable in size, and the Russians, of course, were the ones that discovered this. And yes, there is a territorial dispute in Antarctica with Britain and Argentina having overlapping claims. The Antarctic Treaty is up for renewal. Objectively speaking, now aesthetically, everyone likes Antarctica. They want it to be clean and beautiful. But the continent is so large that it is so large and of such limited ecological value. Right? For the global ecosystem, Antarctica might as well not exist. It's not the Amazon rainforest. It's not rich in life. We all like penguins. Penguins live on this tiny part of the coast. Most of it is just a frozen ice planet. And if you like vast, empty, icy expanses, okay, you can enjoy 1,000 square miles of those, and there's still plenty left over to mine. And say, the idea that, with agency, Britain could become one of the greatest oil producers in the world, rivaling Russia or the United States. You'd have to defeat the climate ideology even much more strongly here, because you'd have to make the positive case for oil. But it is within Britain's capacity to just seize and develop those oil fields. Once the treaty is up for renewal, just don't renew it, and you go there. I think there's so many fun things. There's so many unique opportunities still left in the world, and there are few who understand that perhaps Britain should not be playing it safe, because the default safe future is actually deeply unsafe. It's an old, impoverished future. It's a future where the average age of the citizens is 55, and there's a deep, structurally broken transfer from the young minority to the old majority. And the young minority hates itself anyway, because it's ethnically completely squabbling with each other, because it's completely different cultural groups. And the young people, the talented people, leave an island that's kind of a reverse pyramid scheme to favor the old. So I think that default future of impoverishment has to be escaped. And I think that takes political bravery.
You and I have talked previously, Samo, about how, to my recollection, there is some mockery of Britain's plight amongst Americans, but perhaps behind there's a fear that we are where America could head if it is governed poorly.
I think the United States is very proud about doing better than Europe, because it can't be that proud at doing better than some other places around the world anymore, right? I think the story where China doesn't catch up on AI seems implausible to most observers now, right? But the story where the US remains ahead of Europe, well, that seems plausible. And I think that almost all of the trends that are a big problem in the United Kingdom are also a problem in the United States. And up until this election, they were not getting better. I actually think they're not going to get better even after this election. I think this election did make a difference, but it does not solve these fundamental problems. And so much of the US's economic growth is based on the tech industry that the US losing the tech industry advantage to China is economically equivalent to Germany losing car manufacturing to China, which of course Germany is well in the process of doing, right? But
I was just going to say, we've gone very quickly here in Europe from reading books like How the Germans Do It Better to Kaput, How the German State Has Fallen Apart, right? We've seen how rapidly nations can just totally decline and can fall apart when their underlying
or this optimism about their
disappears.
future, right? Because like in an objective sense, Germany is just not much poorer than it was 5 years ago, but prospects, its future prospects are so diminished to where they were 5 years ago, right? And I think that it goes both ways. A very bleak 5 or 10 or 50-year prognosis can become very optimistic, right? Say, on China, people also were much more optimistic about China's future 5 years ago. So perhaps the race in the world right now is between which country will decline fastest, right? It's like sort of like which country will experience least decline, and that's the winner by default. And I feel like underlying American optimism, I don't think it's truly expansive. I don't think they believe they're going to solve their problems. They just believe they're doing better than everyone else. And so that betrays a deeper pessimism about the state of the world.
Do you think that Britain is just awaiting a great founder figure? Is that what it will take to arrest what seems to be a decline by default?
Yes. Straightforwardly, there is no automatic way out of this. There is no system in place that will course correct. It has to be intervened on by either 1 or 50 or 500 people.
There is a follow-up question then to this is, who are the live players in Britain at the moment? Who are the people who you think understand this and are potentially seizing control of history?
I think that's a very tricky question. I think there are lots of potential contenders, but none of them feel like they're on the cusp of succeeding. So perhaps let's ask this question again in a few years.
And if you had to, what do you tell your clients about Britain's prospects? Presumably what you've told us, that as things stand, things will get worse.
Well, what I say is that I think that people underestimate how easy it would be to... Basically, I think people underestimate how far an intellectual argument can go in Britain and among Britain's elites, where I think they over-index on the American system, where the intellectual arguments are almost irrelevant, and it's all very directly driven by immediate interests among the elected officials. I think to a surprising degree, people in the British civil service, but also in elected government, can follow an argument. They don't always have time for an argument, but they can understand an argument and grasp it. So when I talk to my clients about Britain, I say that it's sort of a dead player, but it has better prospects of revival than any other European country. Like including places like Poland, including places like Hungary, even the bad boys, right? They're not even that bad at the end of the day. Poland is just in the business of making a middle-class society. It doesn't actually have great ideas for how to develop their economy. Despite having good economic growth, they don't have any national champions. The UK has this opportunity for the government to bet strongly on some of these technical questions and achieve quite a bit in partnership with the private sector. But it has to be done in this very directed way and with an understanding that you're trying to play this asymmetric game. But I think that understanding can be achieved. I think literally just speaking to some of the people, presenting facts about the world and presenting their opportunities, I think that'll go farther in the UK than it does in the United States, and it'll go farther in the UK than it does in Germany. And very soon it'll go farther in the UK than it does in China. The Chinese party has its own bureaucratic problems. People, when they say that Xi is a dictator, are missing the forest for the trees. Xi has concentrated power, but that's not because he has broken a previously functioning Chinese Communist Party. It's because so many people in the Chinese Communist Party We're starting to feel that the party itself is broken, dysfunctional, bureaucratic, starting to lose whatever administrative and technocratic edge it had 20 or 30 years ago in the aftermath of the Deng Xiaoping sort of reform of it. So they all bet on Xi. Let's put it this way. Xi Jinping is a populist, but he's a populist of a tiny nation called the Chinese Communist Party that exists within the much larger nation called China. We're talking about what, like a few million people, right? They know their system's broken, and they were hoping Xi would fix it. And so far, he's not managed to. So far, he has stewarded at a decent pace growth set in motion decades ago, but not much else. So Britain has more potential for reforming itself than China does. Is that not a cause for optimism?
Let's put a scenario to you, Samo. You're elected as Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland with a stonking majority. You've got 5 years of clear blue skies ahead of you. What are you going to do to restore Britain's position at the apex of the world?
Maybe not quite clear.
Well,
not quite clear.
First off, I don't renew the Antarctic Treaty. There's a treaty that says that we can't claim territory in Antarctica. No.
Yeah. It ends in it ends 2043 or 2046 or something. Can you tear it up?
No. You're right. It ends up later, but I literally appropriate funding for creating research stations in all the claimed territories in preparation for staking claim in that space. And also for purely research for purposes, begin drilling in Antarctic waters. We don't pump out any of the oil. We're just doing test drills and building test platforms, much as the Japanese do whaling for scientific purposes, right? So that's number one. Number two, hire the South Koreans to build nuclear reactors as quickly and cheaply as possible. National security grounds. We need 10 nuclear reactors in the UK. And then start also working with basically British industry to try to figure out who has the expertise to form basically a new company that in the future can build such reactors. But since we're doing it now, we're just going to go with the South Koreans, who are the cheapest outside of China, and you probably don't want to do business with China in that way, just because it's likely not going to work out. There are 20 other measures you could take, but these two would already expend so much political effort to do. But the story should be that, basically we're abandoning net zero and we're aiming for energy abundance, and we're going to 4x our energy production. And this includes fracking, and it includes nuclear reactors, and it includes us positioning ourselves for the future of fossil fuels. So I would just start there. I would just be like, we cannot beat China on population. We can beat them on energy costs quite easily.
Yeah, energy costs and intelligence, as you said.
Yes, and the data center would be perhaps the loudest thing. The Antarctica thing is the hardest sell, but the easiest sell would be, we are going to build the world's largest supercomputing cluster. We are empowering this businessman to do it, and then you pick someone. You have a small AI industry here. I think literally Demis Hassabis would probably take the deal. It's like, Demis, we want you to leave Google. Here's £1 billion, and we're going to spend way more than that to give your company, the new company you're making, a contract to build the world's largest supercomputing cluster. And we're going to meet with TSMC. We're going to meet with NVIDIA too, if we need to. And we're going to explicitly say, you need to preferentially sell us these chips that you're making in Taiwan, or we will not support Taiwan in a security sense. I would tie those directly.
Oh, that's a bit spicy, Samo.
It's spicy. I mean, you didn't ask me to play it safe, right? So
No.
I'm being pretty spicy. I'm like, okay, Taiwan, you want our security guarantees. We're much less relevant than the United States, but our actions still matter, and symbolically it matters a whole lot, does it not? So, you could sell some of those chips for our big data compute center. And if you want to share in it, dear Taiwanese government, you can have a 10% share in the London supercompute cluster. Also, we'll give you the world's largest embassy. So in case Taiwan is occupied, you can run your servers in your embassy, and you can have a government in exile here in London. Bam.
There it is, listeners. Vote for Samo.
Clearly, a Samo-led administration, we'd have more people blocking the streets, but also the energy would be so cheap.
I mean, the drones would clear them out, right? We'd be building the drones, and the drones would fly around and clear them out, and people would be quite happy if their energy bill goes down, and if their taxation is alleviated, and if they feel that they personally have a future from AI. I think they would be the most optimistic population in the world about AI, actually, because most Americans have only a very weak benefit from AI, actually.
Yeah, I sometimes think of the British electorate as hating tall poppies and being unwilling to accept the difficult decisions regarding stuff like planning that would need to be taken for us to be more prosperous. But maybe this is wrong. It's certainly been a more optimistic electorate in the past, and maybe, as you say, we simply need some leader of some institution to outline a vision that people can truly resonate with.
I think, Tom, it's maybe worth pointing out that. I was just going to say that it's maybe worth pointing out that these hard decisions that the British public have struggled with have been ones that, as Samo was saying, have led them not necessarily to prosperity. It's a lot harder of a sell to ask your population to consume less, have a worse life, have a worse time for your children. It's a much easier sell to say, let's become the richest country in the world again.
Or maybe it must get slightly worse before it gets better.
When it's slightly worse, I think people lose the belief that things can get better. I think slightly worse is if things get much worse very quickly, this produces a temporary reaction. It's like a patient shocked back to life. But very slow, gradual decline, well, that's been happening for 70 years. It could happen for another 700 years. Look at Portugal, right? Portugal is like, an old English ally and has been for a very long time. Portugal shows no sign of waking up from imperial malaise that arguably started, in the 17th century. So let us not wait for slow malaise. Let us, while greatness is still within memory, let's spring into action.
Samo, I think those are a wonderful few words with which to round off this interview. Where can people read more of your work?
People can follow me on x.com at Samo Burja, or they can follow the publication that I publish with my firm called Bismarck Briefs, so brief.bismarckanalysis.com.
And they can read Palladium magazine.
Exactly, palladiummag.com.
Palladiummag.com. Fantastic. When we all meet in person next, let it be in the South Wales Antarctic Territory oil fields.
Inshallah.
Yes.
Until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.